All right, so we're diving deep today into, the foundational principles of information system auditing.
Yeah.
And drawing on like a whole bunch of different sources.
Right.
And I think it's going to be a really interesting sort of look at, what IT auditing is.
Mm-hmm.
And why it's so important for all kinds of organizations, right?
Absolutely.
So, the idea is that we can kind of quickly get a grasp of what this field is all about.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is the more you dive into these materials, the more you see like a really consistent structure, right?
Right, yeah.
It's always kind of like you've got your intro, and then you've got like your key principles, and then it goes into the processes, and then tools and techniques, and of course, the risks.
Yeah.
So it kind of provides a really solid framework, I think, for getting your head around this whole topic.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. So why don't we just, jump right in and get to like, the basics here.
Okay.
What is an organization, like what are we even talking about when we say that?
Well, I mean, at its simplest, it's just, a group of people working together, right, to achieve some objectives.
Right.
And, we're going to focus mostly on companies in this deep dive.
Right.
But really, these principles, they apply to any kind of organized entity, right?
Sure.
Nonprofits, government, you name it.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the interesting things is that the level of IT skills and resources within these organizations, it varies wildly.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You've got some companies with incredibly sophisticated IT departments.
Right.
And then you've got others that are just barely getting by,
Yeah.
So I think as an auditor, that's something you're always having to take into account, right?
Right.
The context, the capabilities, all of that.
Yeah, totally. And, when we talk about organizational structure, that can actually mean a couple different things, right?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you've got kind of the classic corporate hierarchy,
Right.
shareholders at the top, then the board, then management, then employees.
Mm-hmm. The org chart.
Exactly. Yeah. But then, there's also the way that responsibilities and departments are actually structured.
Right.
And a pretty common model is that functional structure, right? Where you
Yeah.
have separate departments for different functions.
Like finance, marketing, all that.
Exactly. And importantly, internal audit often reports directly to the audit committee of the board.
Right.
Why is that so important?
Well, it's all about independence, right?
Right.
That direct line to the audit committee ensures that internal audit can do its job objectively, without being influenced by management.
Yeah.
Kind of like, a referee in a game having to answer to the league, not to the players.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so why is IT so essential? Like, why are we even talking about this? Why is it so vital to organizations?
Well, I mean, think about it, right? It's all about speed, accuracy, being able to analyze mountains of data.
Yeah.
It's about convenience. Like, imagine trying to do your banking today without IT,
Right.
back to paper-based systems and waiting in line.
Yeah.
And IT allows for 247 operations, right?
Yeah.
And it can even help organizations be more environmentally friendly.
Right, for sure. And, our sources really delve into this idea of IT infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And, specifically this distinction between cloud and on-premise.
Yeah, big one these days.
Right, so cloud is essentially virtualized, right? You're not dealing with physical hardware.
Mm-hmm.
It's pay as you go.
Right.
And the provider takes care of a lot of the maintenance, whereas on-premise is, you're buying the servers, you're hosting them yourself.
Right, you're responsible for everything.
Right, and you have that big upfront cost. And then within cloud, you have these different service models, IS, PIS, KIS, SaaS.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, why should an auditor care about these distinctions?
Well, because it changes the game in terms of who's responsible for what, right?
Right.
Like with SaaS, the provider is handling most of the security and maintenance of the infrastructure.
Right.
So your focus as an auditor is more on how is the organization using the application? Are they configuring it securely? Things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas with IS, the organization has more control over the underlying infrastructure. So there's more for you to audit in terms of making sure things are set up properly.
Okay, that makes sense. And then, we've got BI, business intelligence, which is really about, taking all that raw data that companies have and making it understandable, actionable, using charts, graphs, dashboards, like the dashboard in your car giving you all that information.
Right, exactly. Visualization.
Right, exactly. And then there's even more advanced analytics that can like predict future trends and all sorts of things.
Yeah, the predictive stuff is really interesting these days.
Yeah, totally. And then we've got ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning.
Right.
And that's really about integrating all the core business processes across different departments.
Yeah, breaking down those silos.
Exactly. So like imagine, processing a customer order.
Right.
And instead of having like the sales system totally separate from the inventory system and the accounting system,
right.
They all talk to each other seamlessly.
Yeah, and that integration, that's a huge area for auditors, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because it impacts data accuracy, it impacts the effectiveness of controls, and it spans multiple functions within the organization.
Right, right. That makes sense. Okay, so then we have CRM, Customer Relationship Management.
Right.
Which is really focused on, managing customer interactions and data.
Yeah, building those relationships.
Right. So it's kind of like, if you go to your local noodle shop and they know your order.
They know your name.
They know your name. Exactly. They know all about you.
Yep.
And that's, very front office focused,
right.
whereas ERP is more kind of back office operations.
Yeah. Good distinction.
Okay. And then we also see, mentions of CMS for managing website content. DMS as like a digital filing system.
Right, right.
AI, which is enabling computers to like think and learn.
Yeah. Artificial intelligence, huge topic.
Huge topic, right? IoT with all these connected devices.
The Internet of Things, yeah.
Right. And then, of course, databases for structured data.
Right.
It's kind of like, imagine a phone book, but digital. And then you have SQL as a common language to access and manipulate that data.
Yeah. And database security is, a critical area for IT auditors.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. And then you have, big data, which is just these massive data sets.
That require, specialized systems and techniques to process.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, the web with browsers and servers communicating.
And all the security concerns that come with that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So things like the OAuth guidelines are really crucial there.
Absolutely. Got to keep those web applications secure.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay, so finally, let's talk about some of these conceptual tools that we see. So there's PPT, people, process, technology.
Right.
Which is just this reminder that you got to consider all three of those elements.
Yeah, you can't just focus on the tech.
Right, exactly. Then you have RESCI charts, which help to clarify who's responsible for what in a project or process.
Responsible, accountable, consulted, informed.
Exactly. Then there's SIPOC.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Which maps out a process from start to finish.
The supplier, input, process, output, customer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, COBIT.
Right.
Control objectives for information and related technology.
The big framework.
The big framework, right, for IT governance and management.
It's got a lot in it, but it's really useful, for auditors because it provides this comprehensive lens to assess how well an organization is managing and governing its IT.
Yeah.
And it helps to answer the question of, is IT actually supporting the business objectives, which at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right?
Right, exactly. And, COBIT has all these different domains like EDM, which focuses on governance.
Evaluate, direct, monitor.
And then APO, which is more about management.
Align, plan, and organize.
Right, exactly. And, it's important to remember that a framework like COBIT, or really any framework, is really just a structured set of best practices, right?
Yeah, it's a guide, not a rule book.
Right, exactly. So, I think the takeaway for our listener here is that, by understanding how organizations work, the role IT plays, and the risks involved, it becomes clear why we need this structured approach to IT auditing. It's all about, making sure that businesses can make good decisions and continually improve their operations.
Yeah, and I think it's worth considering how all of these interconnected pieces, the organization, the IT, the risks, how they're constantly evolving, especially in your own environment.
Yeah.
And that leads to a really important question, How can organizations ensure that their IT auditing practices are evolving as quickly as the technology itself?
Right. That is a great question to ponder.
A lot to think about.
Yeah, a lot to think about. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
It's been a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, lots to cover.
Lots to cover. But I think we got through it all.
I think so.
So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.